My guest this month has always been interested in castles, having studied castellology in Bangor University in Wales, King's College London, and London School of Economics, before completing his PhD at Cardiff University and further degrees from the University of the Highlands and Islands. Though his research is currently focused on Scottish history, particularly castles in the Highlands, in which he has published a number of books, papers, and organized conferences, it is this one book that I came across a number of years ago that simply wowed me. Crusader Castles of Cyprus, published with the Cyprus Research Center. If you're looking for one of the definitive works on castles that span Cyprus, this is it. And so I'm so honored to have James Petre with me. Dr. James Petre, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you, Andreas.
Early Frankish sources speak of castellum vicinum in Limassol, Castrum Famagustam, castellum Baffes, castellum in Nicosia. What does this tell us about Cyprus's pre-existing castles and fortifications across the island?
Okay, it's an interesting question, Andreas. As far as our sources for what I call the pre-Crusader castles in the island are concerned, we're talking, as per your question, primarily here of the Frankish sources. There's a number of problems, and the first problem is exactly what these Western narratives, what they mean by the use of the word castrum or castellum. As far as Western chroniclers are concerned at this time, particularly in any event, it's very imprecise. It can mean, which of course is what we take for granted, that it's a fort or perhaps a walled town. That's to say, a castle or a castle and its environs. But the word you find when you look at it used as so frequently as it is, certainly in the West, and since these are Western writers, they're going to be talking about Cyprus as well. It can also be a term they use for even a village or something reflecting a function rather than a structure. So, for instance, a place of administration or somewhere of judicial significance. Or perhaps more tangibly, merely a residence of a person of some substance. So that's one problem. What do we understand by castrum castellum when these Western sources are using those terms? The second problem I can offer is we have to make allowances for the prejudices of the authors. So these guys who are writing these, chronicles primarily, they fundamentally want to enhance the reputations of the Crusaders that they are telling the stories of. So, for instance, therefore, what you tend to think is the case is that when they talk about a castrum or a castellum in one situation or another, they're perhaps exaggerating the formidable nature of these places in order to make their heroes, for example, Richard the Lionheart, most obviously, to make them look as if they've been more heroic, they've been more militarily successful in taking a very strong castle when the castle was never strong in the first place. And, so the evidence for what few castles we've got, so for example, at Limassol and when I say castles, what are reputed to be castles or towers at places like Limassol and Famagustam, the way the chronicles are written, suggests that there are strong towers there, or there's one particular chronicle talks about a tower on a lofty height. And these, I think, are written, as I say, it's kind of form of rhodomontade almost. There's an example that maybe illustrates what I'm talking about quite well, as regards, the castle or whatever it was in Nicosia at the time. That's variously described as strong. That's to say, strong when Richard the Lionheart is taking it. But then, alternatively, it's also described as weak, which is maybe the reason why the Templars in 1192 can't defend it. So I think a lot of it is based on the particular aspect of propaganda that the chroniclers are trying to promote.
Right.
So I mean that's part of my feelings on the trouble we've got with the sources for what's going on before 1191.
But we can't say with a certain degree of confidence that there were Byzantine fortifications. I mean, in Nicosia and Famagusta, it's a little bit more vague and ambiguous. But can we say with a degree of certainty that there were Byzantine fortifications on the Kyrenia mountain range. Is
Oh
that
yeah,
something
yeah,
we can confidently assume?
yeah. Absolutely. I mean, if we sort of start to pinpoint individual sites, individual cases, then yes. I mean, quite so. I mean, certainly, I think we're all happy that those three castles on the Kyrenia range, the Pentadactylos range, that they're there in Byzantine times, and we know that, I think, for various reasons, and we can ascribe various possible causes to why they're there in the first place. There's certainly something in Paphos going back quite some time. Quite what something is quite an involved matter. Whether there was anything that we would remotely identify as a castle in Limassol, I think is very open to doubt. If there was anything in Nicosia, it's probably more likely to have been a governor's residence rather than a fortification of any kind of substance or seriousness. And Famagusta, well, I mean, the evidence for that is so negligible as to be almost worthy of being dismissed. Kyrenia, of course, is another case in altogether. I mean, that was clearly a Byzantine castle of some note. So I think it depends on which particular site we're talking about. And it's interesting, perhaps, that we are going to 1191, that kind of crucial watershed, that if you think, where does Richard the Lionheart and his army choose to land? Well, he lands at Limassol. Now, he was not stupid militarily. If Limassol had been defended adequately with fortifications of any consequence that might vaguely reflect what one or two of the chroniclers have said, then he probably wouldn't have landed there. So arguably, and this has been put by people much more sensible than I am, like Richard Gillingham, that John Gillingham, sorry, that one of the reasons why he chose Limassol was because it was so vulnerable. There was no fortifications other than possibly a few barricades that the self-made emperor had sort of made up on the spot on the occasion.
The castles on the Kyrenia range, do we know, can we say with any degree of confidence when they were first built and why the Byzantines would have chosen those particular spots?
There's a whole host of possibly alternative answers to that one. I mean, in terms of their architecture, I mean, I don't think the Byzantine architecture at those castles can be so pinned down as to say exactly when in the Byzantine period it was they were constructed. I mean, if we broadly divide Byzantine military architecture into early, middle, and late, whenever it is, we're looking at the middle period. But as to I mean, the more interesting question, I suppose, which is no doubt just as unanswerable, is to quite what would have prompted them, what would have inspired their construction in the first place. And there's a whole list of possibilities, and I just very quickly breeze through them. I mean, starting off chronologically, there may be an apprehension of Arab raids back in the 7th century, when just before the island was divided into two separate jurisdictions, between, as a result of the treaty between the Byzantine emperor and the Sultan. So it could have been as early as that. It could alternatively have been the Byzantine consolidation of the island after its recovery in 965. Another set of possibilities date us to the late 11th century. First of all, it may have been because of the emerging threat of the Seljuks on the Anatolian mainland to the north. It might have been possibly, although I doubt this one, it was that they were created by Rapsamates, the rebellion that he raised in 1092. Might have been again Alexius I after the suppression of that rebellion. And at the very end of this time, before the advent of the Crusaders, it could have been again Alexius I, because of what he perceived as being the incipient Crusader threat. I don't think we can go beyond speculating along those lines at the moment, anyway.
Fair enough. A lot of listeners are probably aware of some of the names of those castles, Cantata, Buffavento, Saint Hilarion. Do we know if they had names? These Byzantine fortifications, did they have names that pre-exist these presumably Latin names?
Yeah, I mean, in George Hill's, monumental 4-volume tome, and at some point in the appropriate volume, which I suppose is going to be the early part of volume 2, he's got a very heavy footnote where I think he lists a whole kind of host of alternative names, some of which are Byzantine, and I've certainly in my book got in my gazetteer alternative names under each entry where I know of them. The majority are not necessarily Byzantine, and one or two are. I mean, we know, of course, Centenarion seem to have had this name of Didymus, or meaning, I think, twin mounts. Buffavento is called the castle of the Leon. I've got a note about this somewhere, which I scribbled out. Oh, here we go. Leonton, Leon, meaning the castle of the lion. So Buffavento. The other ones, well, the ones for Cantara, I think they're probably like Candar. I think they're probably all Frankish. But yes, as I say, I mean, certainly in my book we've got a few names, but I think George Hill is probably the great authority on that.
Yeah.
One of his enormous footnotes.
Yeah. Now, apart from the archaeological work, what are the sources for this period? And I mean, I suppose this is a bit of a silly question. What makes them so important?
Well, we have the entries in the diaries, I suppose, if you like, of travelers. I mean, there were travelers coming from the west, coming from, I suppose, Greece to the Holy Land before the Crusaders ended up there. We know of that, and of course, that was definitely the case after the advent of the Crusaders. And the value the value of their records, I suppose, is that what travelers were doing, they were writing down their observations of what in a way was a kind of holy holiday, a bit like if we go on holiday, we're apt to write down what we see and what we've done, and we record the impact that our new experiences have on us, which of course local people tend not to do. It's, for example, it's just, if you live in London, you don't sort of write a great big diary entry about the wonders of the British Museum or of the or the British Library, because you take it for granted. Whereas if you're a traveller passing through, then you'll go on and rave about it, and that becomes a source for future people, arguably. So,
which I suppose goes far in explaining why we don't really have many Byzantine sources talking about these castles
from within the island. I mean, I suppose it's because, there just aren't that many. I mean, and what few there are. So for example, St. Neophytus, I don't think, they considered, castles, fortifications. I don't think they considered them to be of any consequence. I mean, and so, for instance, when we pick up the old reference to any kind of fortification, here I'm thinking of Paphos in particular, from a source such as that, it's entirely incidental. I mean, so Neophytus says at some point, is it the 1050s, that he mentions the existence of some sort of fortification in Paphos for the simple reason he'd been imprisoned there. I think he'd been mistaken to be some sort of thief. And so he was basically saying, well, look, I've been put in prison for a night in Paphos in such and such a place, which he would not have mentioned just for the sake of the fortification, whatever it was, were it not for that.
What's typical of a Byzantine castle? I mean, I know a lot of people, when we think of castles, we think of that Western Arthurian sort of image that's conjured up. We don't really associate castles with Byzantium. So how would it compare, say, to the fortifications that you would see in Western Europe?
Well, I think the reality is there's an awful lot of similarity. There's, coincidentally and kind of conveniently, a book came out in 2022 by a guy you probably know, Nikos Kontogiannis. I don't know if you've come across that, but what Nikos has done, I know this, I had to review it for a journal, I think. What Nikos has done is to try and pull together a history, and also an archaeological and architectural analysis of Byzantine fortifications from start to end, which is an enormous job, considering not just the chronological framework, but also, the geographicals. So that, I guess, is a modern day convenience. But to answer your question more directly, the fact is there's much in common between, East and West. So, for instance, you see curtain walls, you see projecting towers, gatehouses. But once you start sort of ferreting into those attributes, then it becomes a bit more interesting, because, if you get into the nitty gritty, you can perhaps start to deduce things, and as far as towers are concerned, say, by looking at the shapes of the towers, as far as gatehouses are concerned, quite what design they follow, what attributes they have. And some of those details you can dissect and suggest that a particular sort of tower or a particular kind of gatehouse, for instance, have greater popularity in Byzantine military architecture than Western. But it's very difficult because there's a lot of interplay between East and West in both directions. And while I'm sure that the West is learning from the Roman Empire, which of course is what it was, equally as time goes on, there's influence going in the opposite direction. So it's not in that respect so surprising that you have lots of examples where it's not necessarily a straightforward case to tell the difference, but you can perhaps discern differences when it comes to looking at such things as the masonry. So we know, although again here there are difficulties, there's a lot of Byzantine masonry. Here I'm talking about the facing masonry, in other words that which you see when you look at these places. In the period, let's say roughly, just before Crusader conquest in 1191, a lot of what they were building in Cyprus consisted of fairly small facing stones, and you get examples. And Buffavento is a good example of bands of bricks, which are almost kind of creating a pattern in the walls and in the towers.
You're talking about that traditional sort of Byzantine pattern. I mean, if you think of the outer walls of Theodosius in Constantinople, how they've reconstructed them, is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, sure, that's right. And I mean that's absolutely the case. So you get that on occasion. You get fragments of it in Cyprus, but of course, I'm saying here, of course, that the facing stones for Byzantine work in Cyprus tend to be fairly small, perhaps a bit unimpressive, and you can see the same in Byzantine works in the Holy Land before it gets taken over by the Muslims. But that's not consistent. I mean, so for example, the Theodosian walls, which of course we know are much earlier, the stonework there, the facing work, you're using big blocks, and you start to see Byzantine work using big blocks, later in the 12th century in the Holy Land. So it's a bit of a tricky one. I mean, but there are other bits and pieces that you can tack together. I mean, so for instance, it seems to be the case that archers, let's say entry archers primarily, they seem to be round-headed, principally in Byzantine work, whereas with the Crusader work, they're going to have a slight point. So you get pointed archers rather than round archers. And then you get into the more techie stuff, which I haven't really drilled into that much, which is mortar. Of course, checking mortar these days, I mean, certainly in the area with which I'm currently concerned, primarily Scotland, testing, analyzing, the mortar is now a big deal. Largely because by doing that, carbon 14 testing, you can get some sort of line on exactly what the date is, which clearly is of great interest. But it seems to be the case that Byzantine mortar is slightly different from the mortar that the Franks used, in as much as the Franks seem to have used greystone grit mortar, which isn't quite the same stuff that the Crusaders used, although quite how you would describe that is another matter. So it gets kind of rather technical, and mortar is a matter I must get more into once I touch on this subject once again, whenever I get the time to do that.
The castles, they also had a lot of similarities. I think you did touch on that. I think I would imagine they would have had cisterns and portcullises and drawbridges. These would have been similar between the two cultures.
Yeah, I mean, talking of portcullises, you see portcullises in Byzantine work and also in the West. Drawbridges is an interesting one because, again, drawbridges, they're a very common feature in the West, but Byzantine gatehouses don't seem to have them, at least, the ones I've looked at. So there seems to be a bit of a difference there. And then, I mean, we were talking about towers and gatehouses. As I say, you can really go into this and look at the different shapes and try and deduce what you can from a preference to use one particular shape in the West and its absence in the East, and vice versa. So you can perhaps try and draw some conclusions from that kind of analysis, which is what I tried to do in a particular case study in my book although all I'm doing is making a controversial subject even more controversial.
If anyone listening has ever been to some of the castles in Cyprus, one of the things that's very striking, and I'll just bring up my own experiences in Colossi Castle in Limassol, is how seemingly barren it looks on the inside. The interiors, they just look drab, cold, damp, not very inviting at all. How would they have looked in their prime?
Well, crowded, the opposite to what we see now. And you mentioned Colossi, I think. Yes, I remember those times I went there, that's exactly how they seemed. They seemed, like voids, rooms full of nothing, except what was, part of the masonry on the walls. But yes, in their day, taking Colossi as an example, there would have been furniture and, of course, on the ground floor in Colossi, but elsewhere as well, with those vaults, they would have been full of stores. So they would have been quite different in what we see now. Bigger places with, if you like, an open space in the middle, like Kyrenia, I guess I'm thinking of, you'd have had more buildings around the inside of the wall, which have probably not survived, especially if they were made of timber, which some of them would have been. So I think they would have looked, decidedly different in those days to what they are now.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Rich tapestries and carpeting as well, right?
Yeah,
it's a warm place, isn't it?
I think so. Yes. Tapestries were definitely a feature of castles. They obviously were not. They were there for decorative reasons, but I suppose they would have had an ancillary value in terms of providing some sort of insulation as well.
So when Richard I arrives on Cyprus in 1191, the sources generally agree that it took a little more than a month for him to capture all the fortifications across the island. In your understanding, why was he so successful in his campaigns?
Well, for one thing, I think his troops were well motivated, well equipped, and they had a good leader. That's for sure. As far as Isaac, his opponent, is concerned, I don't think he was militarily very bright. I think his support was half-hearted at best, and I don't think that his main contingents were anything like as well trained or as well equipped as the men-at-arms and knights that Richard brought with him. So I think that was one aspect. Richard's superior military savoir-faire and his motivation and his support, and the opposite as far as Isaac was concerned. But of course, not forgetting about castles, one can throw that into the mix and say that from what little we can deduce about the castles or fortifications that Isaac had, he didn't really have an awful lot that he could depend upon. Whatever was in Nicosia was pretty inadequate. Whatever was in Famagustam, if indeed there was anything, was totally inadequate. He ended up, of course, retreating to the various of the mountain castles in Kyrenia, and he, or at any rate, his supporters put up some sort of a defense there, but it seems to have been pretty short-lived, which may be a combination of reasons that the castles were not in commission at the time, or that his followers thought, well, why should we fight for this guy, because after all, he's a bit of a tyrant. So it was quite a remarkable achievement, I suppose. Taking over an entire site. What is it? Is it the third largest island in the Med? Taking over
third largest.
Yeah, taking over a sizable island, from start to finish in such a short period of time was, quite remarkable. And I think, his chroniclers, Richard's chroniclers, of course, saw that and wrote about it. And I know that John Gillingham, whom I know, or I did know, made a great deal of this in his estimation of Richard I, as indeed he does in his biographies.
How quickly did Richard the Lionheart or the Templars or Guy de Lusignan, how quickly did they take to rebuilding and refortifying the castles? If I remember right, the castles were in various states of disrepair. And now, was this due to conflict, or was this years of neglect?
In a way, that goes back to what we were talking about at the outset, as to the state of the castles at the time. I think, for me, the castles that Richard encountered in 1191 were in disrepair largely because of neglect. I've no particular evidence that comes to mind anyway that suggests that they were, they'd had any sustained attention. I mean, it may well be that in the crisis for Isaac that emerged in 1191, he tried to hastily, do some kind of superficial works in what little time he had, such as creating barricades at Limassol where there were no other fortifications, and whatever he might have been able to do at the mountain castles at Kyrenia and at Kyrenia, but he would have had little time to do it, few resources in which to do it, and the scope for actually achieving anything would have been very, very limited. So I don't see, if this is answering the question, that there was much going on when Richard landed.
Yeah, I mean, when you think of castle building, I mean, at least in for most, I would think for most castles, it's it's a source of defense, right? Fortifications, right?
Yeah.
And maybe in the case of Cyprus, I mean, I had assumed that these were quickly rebuilt and refortified to prevent the potential of a Byzantine recapture. But I believe you make the point, and I'm going to quote here, quote, to emphasize their own regality to their subjects, end quote. And that really struck me. What is this that you base it on? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit more, because I'm being a little bit vague here. What is it that you're trying to say, and what is it that you base this on?
It's all a matter of interpretation, really. I mean, I take a fairly kind of trenchant view that castles are as much designed in the first place for as much as for offense and domination rather than defense. So I don't. First of all, I mean, I've written quite a lot about this perceived threat that the Crusaders, the first Lusignans, felt from the possible Byzantine resurgence. And I know this in the past seems to have been perceived wisdom. The reason why one or two fortifications that may be dated to that early period were built was because of an apprehension of the Byzantines coming to try to grab back their island. I don't see that as being so real. I mean, if you really kind of dissect the situation, the circumstances at the time, other kind of possible threats, well, okay, pirate raids, but they're pretty minor affairs on balance, although there were some fairly bad ones. I think for me, I mean, the reason why, basically the fundamental reason why castles in general in Cyprus, but also elsewhere, and we can go into details about particular sites, but the reason why I think is to actually symbolically establish the visible signs of a new regime, and to say to everybody, whoever the everybody is, both your peasants, not that I saw that there was ever a threat from the parents, but the peasants, but also your neighbors, whether they're threatening you or they're just coming along as visitors. It's a substantial, it's a tangible way of saying, we are here. This is a new setup. This is a new regime. We mean something, and you must treat us on equal terms. So I think it's a sort of demonstration of the substance of the regime. That's how I see it.
Yeah, it reminds me now, as you're talking, it reminds me of, I think, the Tower of London. I think that the Tower of London it's been argued that it too was built for that purpose as well, just to show the local populace, hey, we're here, and this is our authority.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, William the Conqueror in 1066, and shortly after it, he one of the first things he does, of course, is to set up castles, and most demonstrably in London, to say, well, here I am, this is it, I mean business. Right. Okay, of course, you can say that, these castles are there in this case, the Anglo-Saxons have a go at him, but the Anglo-Saxons in England in 1066 are a different sort of ball game to, what the Lusignans had when they got to Cyprus in 1191. They weren't apprehensive at all, I'm sure, of any possible local uprising, any kind of vestige of the remnants of loyalty to the self-made emperor. I mean, from what one can see, there wasn't any.
Yeah, that's right. For anyone listening, if they've ever been to St. Hilarion in the north of Cyprus, it is one of the, at least for me. I mean, I don't claim to have visited many castles in my life, but it is very impressive. I would think it's an engineering marvel. how do they build castles like this? Did they use local engineering know-how, or and to add to that, were locals pressed into providing the manpower for the construction of these castles? Like, how were they planned and built, so to speak?
Well, I mean, in general, the short answer is no, we don't know. I'm sticking to Cyprus here. We don't have, as we do, for example, in England, we don't have government-generated records to say which particular mason or master carpenter was commissioned, how much he was paid, and where he was paid to do the work, and quite when this was. So we don't know. We don't have records that would really pin the matter down like that. We don't know, although we can speculate on the extent of the influence exerted by the Lusignans themselves. So we can hazard guesses as to the extent to which a particular Lusignan king made suggestions as to quite what the design of the castle he wanted to be elaborate and what kind of shape it would take. But they're guesses. I mean, what we can, I think, rely on is that the castles that we see in Cyprus reflect designs that are practiced elsewhere. So there are influences coming from different directions. But there's one particular case that might be of interest where we do have records, and that's the people who are press ganged to start on the walls of Famagustam in 1308. So we know that when the town walls are being constructed, I think starting in 1308, maybe a little bit before, but I only know of them from 1308, that there are slaves are sent to work on the walls. These are slaves that had belonged to the Templars, who of course by then had been disestablished. The Pope was persuaded to award indulgences to any Cypriot who was prepared to come along and work on the walls. And then we also know that peasants were commandeered to come along and dig the ditches. So quite clearly, as far as non-specialist work was concerned, there would be local labor impressed. And that has to be the case because you think about the size of some of these works and the efforts required to build them. They would have required a lot of manpower, and a lot of this manpower wouldn't necessarily have to be specialists, most obviously for things like digging ditches. So I think that has to be taken for granted, that there's a lot of local labor used for the basic heavy duty stuff, not for the specialist stuff like dressing stones and putting them in the right way.
You sort of just hinted at this in your response just now. I was surprised to learn about the Armenian influence on castle building. In what way do we have Armenian influence, or other foreign influence for that matter?
Well, after the book came out, I think it was 2016, I wrote an article exactly on this subject, which it's in a collection of articles, which was a festschrift for Dennis Pringle, brought out by the University of Cardiff. General background is the tremendous amount of Armenian influence that there was in Cyprus, certainly before 1191, and to some extent after it as well. It's written down, I think, somewhere that the Armenian population, this is before the Crusaders, before the Franks arrived in 1191, they were the biggest ethnic minority in Cyprus, after the locals, of course. So there's a large Armenian population there. Over and above that, we know that at various times there were Armenian troops, Armenian soldiers brought in by the Byzantine Empire for specific purposes, such as the defense of villages or the mountain passes in the Kyrenia range. So they had a military reputation as well. And then, of course, we can see Armenian influence in architecture, and we see this especially in one particular castle, which is Kantara. If you have a look at the architectural features of Kantara Castle, it more than any other, I think, or certainly especially, shows architectural features that you see across the Anatolian Sea in Cilicia. So there's a direct correlation there, and I'm for my money, I'm pretty satisfied. I have to say this because I've written about it. There is an Armenian influence certainly on Kantara, and if there's one on Kantara, then it would have percolated through elsewhere, I suspect.
My understanding, and just shifting gears here a little bit, is that the castles such as St. Hilarion, they appear to have been used as royal resorts at times. Now, was this typical, or was this an exception? And a follow-up to that is, And I've always wondered this in Cyprus in particular. Where did the knights live, and where did the kings and queens of Cyprus live, for that matter?
Okay, well, Centenarion is the classic case as far as the first question is concerned. That is seen to be, has been said to be by various writers, something of a royal resort, a kind of summer retreat, where the royal family could get away from the heat of the summer plain and also from the plague, which of course, crops up in Cyprus as devastatingly as anywhere else, from 1348-ish onwards. So I think Centenarion is exceptional in as much as you can say it was a royal resort, and some kind of additional evidence or support for that point of view is in its architecture, because up there at the top there is a belvedere, quite plainly built as a wonderful leisurely viewing point, spectacular view that you'll get over the north coast. But in general, I don't think that the rest of the castle's fortifications that the Lusignans had could be classified as that. So I don't see them as being a royal resort, with the exception of Centenarion. As to quite where the kings and queens and the knights lived, what we seem to have in Cyprus is what I call an urban aristocracy. So it's not living most of the time out and about on its in its various residences, its various possessions. The monarchy, to all intents and purposes, is static in its capital, in Nicosia. Okay, sometimes it goes to Famagustam when that becomes quite clearly the second city of the kingdom, but by and large it's static in Nicosia. And the same seems to be largely true of the aristocracy. Nicosia, for example, is called as the city of the knights, and we know that they had their houses there. It's certainly the case that they had estates out in the country, which they would perhaps go to frequently for the purposes of hunting primarily. But it's interesting that those residences, insofar as we can identify them, and that is a very difficult matter in itself, are quite clearly not fortified. There are a few occasions we know of when, a particular member of the aristocracy is recorded as having been on such and such an estate, usually when, they're captured or there's some particular problem that makes the story worthy of comment. But by and large, the knights, like the king, they are they're in the capital. So they're, it's an urban aristocracy primarily.
I noticed that there was construction of town walls in 13th century, at least in Famagusta, 14th century in Lefkosia. I suppose it's considered relatively late, especially when you consider how they contrast to the walled fortifications in Syria. Now, eventually, walls are built. Why so late? Like, what's the reasoning in building the walls when they were built?
Well, for me, the most interesting example of that is Famagusta. I don't see. It's hard. I mean, it's hard to generalize. I mean, it's much easier to take site by site, I'm afraid. But I mean, taking Famagusta, which is a classic instance of what I think is misunderstanding. I mean, from what I can see, that the town walls there aren't actually begun until 1308. And when you think that that's, let me think, 17 years after the fall of Acre in 1291. When supposedly, the Muslims have overrun the Holy Land and they're about to spill over the 40 miles or whatever it is to Cyprus and take that as well. Mm-hmm. There was really an apprehension of a Muslim threat to Cyprus as a result of the fall of Acre in 1291. Then you would have expected the Lusignan monarchy to have started to do something about it pretty quickly. But of course, they don't do that. 17 years later, it looks like then, but only then, do they start to get around to doing something about the walls of Famagusta. So I don't see those town walls as being the result of a military threat. I mean, for me, it's for something altogether quite different, which is, and Stephen of Lusignan in his one of his works in the 16th century, he says quite clearly that what the object of the exercise in terms of walling Famagusta was to try and make it as attractive for merchants. In other words, to establish it as the hub of an emporium, exactly like Acre had been. So in other words, the object of the exercise was economic. It wasn't military. Kyrenia is a bit tricky because it may well have been that there was some walls there, although not very substantial, a lot earlier. But there you have to start to speculate what would have caused those. The walls in Nicosia itself are a bit harder to pin down, partly because we haven't got much of them left, I suppose. But I mean, certainly when things start to go wrong in the second half of the 14th century for the Lusignans, and I'm thinking here primarily about the attacks of the Genoese starting in 1373, that, quite clearly then, there was reason to start to take more seriously the value of having walled towns. And it's interesting that, in, I think, 1373, when the Genoese threat really materializes, that suddenly there's this enormous effort made to make defenses, the walls of Nicosia, into something that can actually resist an enemy, which suggests that, whatever was there before in the earlier part of the 14th century was, totally inadequate. So, yes, so again, you kind of have to look at this in the context of why they were built and, the particular periods in question. And, and again, you can say the same of Famagustam, I suppose, when there were threats to that, when warfare was actually knocking on the door, then efforts will be made. But I think to begin with, I suppose what I'm saying in general is that the slow development of these walled towns, which don't seem to necessarily occur as a result of an external military threat, but for other reasons altogether. And there's an interesting sideline on this, which has always kind of vaguely attracted me, is that there's a sort of, what's his name, Nikos Kontogiannis, he kind of picks this up in his recent book on Byzantine architecture. He talks about a metaphysical aspect. And of course, Gianni Perbellini, the Italian, I think he talks about this as well. And what they're getting at here is it's a separation of, the civilized area, which is contained within the walls of the town, from the uncivilized area that's outside it. So it's kind of destroying a distinction. This is what is being said between the arcane, that's to say the civilized towns, and the outside, which is the profane. So there's that sort of metaphysical aspect to it as well, which, as I say, these scholars who've gone before me have come up with. I mean, how much substance do you want to give to that? I don't know, but it's an interesting one to speculate on.
You mentioned already about the Genoese attacking Cyprus. We know later in the 1420s, the Mamluks attack the Saracens 20 years after that. Eventually, when the Venetians arrive, a lot of the fortifications were in a state of decay. Now, is this because of the conflicts and the attacks throughout these different periods? Is there an economic collapse, for lack of a better word? And we know that the Venetians abandoned these fortifications, these castles. So can you kind of wrap this up? Like, what's happening towards the end of this period?
I mean, as far as this is concerned, I think economics is also a very important aspect. What we've got in this period is an economic downturn. I mean, we've perhaps mentioned briefly, have we, the Black Death, which, again, I've already mentioned, hit Cyprus as heavily as pretty much anywhere else. Not just that one occasion, but of course the plague returns to Cyprus on a number of occasions. You've then got attacks of locusts, which wipe out harvests. You have the results of the raids that have been perpetrated by the Genoese, and then, of course, subsequently by the Mamluks in the 1420s, and subsequently, as on those occasions you've mentioned. You have also factors outside the control of the island, decline in the trade, which Cyprus depended on so heavily for revenue, for entirely external factors, which one could sort of go through, all of which reduced the revenue available to the king. And of course, without any money, you can't build, frankly. So the country it's in decline, in terms of all those aspects, population, agrarian, the trade aspect, which all lead to a reduction in the revenue that's available to the king. Things get pretty bad. I mean, and interestingly enough, I think an example of this is what happens in 1472, because in 1472, surprisingly, there is a revolt of the peasants, which is put down with quite some brutality. But I say that's interesting because right until that late period in the Lusignans' history, the peasants, as we've said already, have been pretty quiescent. They've not been a problem. They've just been passive, and they got on with their lives, and they haven't really cared who were their masters, as long as their lives were not too intolerable. But then they're getting so bad that they actually rise up in a peasants' revolt in 1472. I mean, it's kind of not been known before. So basically the royal treasury is in a bad way, and there's no money, regardless of whatever the motives might have been, to keep their fortifications in any kind of state of good repair. And I suppose what money they did have and they did deploy would have been on the palatial buildings in Nicosia itself. And wrapping it up, as you say, moving on to Venice, why do they do what they do, which is the fundamental question. Well, here we're talking about a complete change that isn't just peculiar to Cyprus. It's happening all over Europe and the British Isles. It's part of the overall matter of the so-called decline of the castle, and in its place the rise of the fort and the fortified city. And again, because I'm based in England, I'm bound to use England and Scotland as comparisons. But Cyprus is of a special interest here because it's being taken over by Venice, and of course Venice is not a monarchy that you could compare with the Lusignans. It's a city-state. Its entire ethos, its entire purpose is based on economic gain, and not just economic gain, but maritime economic gain. So in this particular case, Venice, it's not interested in the interior of the country. There's no point in them wasting their time and resources on places like the mountain castles. Most obviously, they're much more focused on three locations only, really, to all intents and purposes. And that's Nicosia, Kyrenia, and Famagustam, although they do work at Baffes quite clearly. So what they're focused on is consolidating their control against potential rivals, like the Genoese, but increasingly as time goes on, the Ottomans. But I think they're also, in a way, mimicking what I see as being done before, by the Lusignans in Famagustam and elsewhere. For example, the Valois kings in southern France, when they set up their fortified port at Aigues-Mortes in that new area that they'd obtained in the last quarter or thereabouts of the 13th century. What they're doing is they're setting up shop. They're making fortifications. They're military in outlook, but they're also providing a facility for the expansion of their economy, their mercantile trade. It so happens that as time goes on, in the 16th century, the fortifications of Famagustam especially, but also, Nicosia for sure, and Kyrenia, they get to be really, really terrific. Here you're looking at massive gunpowder artillery fortifications, which are incredibly impressive. But that's a reflection, I suppose, of their perception of an increasing threat, which, of course, as we know, was not... it wasn't a fantasy, and it came to reality in 1571. That's a bit of a ramble, but I hope that kind of says something of what I'm thinking.
Oh no, absolutely, James. This was wonderful. Again, thank you so much for your book. Is great. I know you said you wrote it a long time ago, and it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, given that you have new interests and new projects at hand. But to me, it's one of the most definitive books I've ever come across on the castles of Cyprus, and I really do hope that you consider a second edition because it is fantastic.
Very kind of you to say so. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Cheers.